They say you should always read the fine print. What they don't tell you is that sometimes the fine print is the only thing standing between you and corporate managers who've confused their authority with permission to rewrite reality. I learned that on a Wednesday afternoon in October, sitting across from HR Director Monica Barrett and my soon-to-be former boss Derek Hamilton, listening to them explain why my employment at Meridian Capital was being terminated for cause. The reason, according to the termination letter they had prepared, was insubordination and failure to follow direct management instructions. The reality, according to the employment contract I'd negotiated 3 years earlier, and apparently they'd never read carefully, was that they'd just made an expensive mistake. My name is James Parker, and I used to be the Director of Risk Management at Meridian Capital, a mid-sized investment firm managing approximately $4 billion in client assets. Used to be because that Wednesday afternoon, Derek decided that my refusal to approve a trade he wanted to make constituted insubordination, worthy of immediate termination. What he didn't realize was that the employment contract I'd signed when joining the firm, the one that HR had approved and filed away without reading the details, contained a severance clause that made termination for cause extremely expensive unless the cause was very specifically defined. The conflict had been building for 6 months. Derek had joined Meridian as Chief Investment Officer in April, brought in by the CEO to modernize our investment approach and take advantage of opportunities our risk-averse culture had been missing. Translation: take bigger risks with client money, chase higher returns without appropriate concern for downside scenarios, and override the risk management team whenever we pointed out that his strategies violated our stated risk parameters. He'd come from a hedge fund that had posted impressive returns during the bull market by taking concentrated positions in high-growth tech stocks. When those stocks went up, the returns looked genius level. When they went down, the losses were managed through aggressive hedging strategies that worked until they didn't. Derek had left that fund shortly before. A particularly bad quarter wiped out 2 years of gains, timing that was either lucky or calculated depending on who you asked. My job was to identify, assess, and communicate risks associated with investment decisions. Not to prevent all risk, that was impossible and undesirable, but to ensure that risks were understood, appropriately sized, and aligned with client expectations and regulatory requirements. It was technical work requiring careful analysis, detailed knowledge of financial instruments and market dynamics, and the ability to say no when trades fell outside acceptable parameters. Meridian's clients were primarily high-net-worth individuals and family offices who valued capital preservation as much as growth. They'd invested with us specifically because we weren't aggressive, because our approach was measured and diversified, because we'd navigated the 2008 crisis and the COVID volatility better than most competitors. Our marketing materials emphasized disciplined risk management and prudent capital allocation. Those weren't just buzzwords, they were contractual promises to clients about how their money would be managed. Derek hated when I said no. He'd come from a proprietary trading background where risk managers were seen as obstacles rather than partners, where pushing boundaries was rewarded and caution was viewed as weakness. He wanted Meridian to be aggressive, to compete with funds that took concentrated positions in volatile sectors, to show returns that would attract new capital, even if it meant taking risks that didn't align with our client base or our regulatory obligations. The first conflicts had been over position sizing. Derek wanted to concentrate positions, betting big when he had conviction, building 5 to 7% positions in individual stocks, rather than the 1 to 2% positions that our risk parameters allowed. He'd argued that diversification was a way to admit you didn't know what you were doing, that real portfolio managers took concentrated bets when they found genuine opportunities. I'd push back. Concentrated positions are fine if clients understand and accept the volatility. Our clients have explicitly chosen a diversified approach. They've signed investment mandates that limit individual position sizes to 2% of portfolio value. You can't change the strategy without changing the client agreements. The 2% limit is arbitrary. It's not based on any rigorous analysis of optimal portfolio construction. It's based on client risk tolerance and our stated investment philosophy. Whether it's optimal in some academic sense doesn't matter. It's what we promised clients we'd do. We'd compromised on that one. Derek agreed to stay within the position limits for existing clients, but insisted on more flexibility for new client accounts where expectations could be set differently from the start. Not ideal, but workable. The second conflict had been over derivatives. Derek wanted to use options and futures to amplify returns, to express views with leverage, to structure trades that had asymmetric payoffs. Some derivative usage was reasonable, hedging currency risk, managing downside exposure, adjusting portfolio duration. But Derek's proposals went further, into speculative strategies that increased rather than reduced risk. We're not set up for this operationally, I'd explained during a risk committee meeting. Complex derivatives require specialized accounting, more sophisticated margin management, different regulatory reporting. We'd need to upgrade our systems and hire people with relevant experience before we could implement these strategies safely. Other firms do it. Why can't we? Other firms built their operations around derivatives trading. We built ours around long-only equity and fixed income. You can't just bolt derivatives onto an infrastructure that wasn't designed for them. That conflict had escalated to the CEO, who'd sided with me after learning about the operational risks. Derek had been forced to table his derivatives proposals, at least temporarily, and I'd earned his permanent resentment for blocking something he'd wanted to do. The breaking point had come over a proposed trade in distressed debt. Derek wanted to take a $15 million position in bonds issued by a company that was clearly headed for bankruptcy. His thesis was that the bonds were trading below their recovery value, that bankruptcy proceedings would eventually pay out more than current market price, and that the trade represented a compelling risk-reward opportunity. I'd reviewed the analysis and disagreed. The company's capital structure was complex, with multiple layers of debt and uncertain collateral values. Recovery rates in similar bankruptcies had been lower than Derek's model assumed. The position size was too large relative to the liquidity of the bonds. We'd have trouble exiting if the thesis proved wrong. And most importantly, distressed debt investing wasn't part of the strategy we'd disclosed to clients. They'd invested in Meridian expecting a conservative, diversified approach, not speculative positions in near-bankrupt companies. I can't approve this trade, I'd told Derek during the risk committee meeting, where he'd presented the opportunity. The position size is too large, the recovery assumptions are optimistic, and it's outside our stated investment mandate. The risk-reward is excellent, Derek had argued. We're getting paid to take a risk that's more manageable than the market thinks. Maybe, but even if your analysis is correct, the position size means this single trade represents significant concentration risk. If you're wrong, we lose a meaningful percentage of the fund. That's not consistent with the risk profile we've promised clients. That's exactly the kind of risk-averse thinking that's kept Meridian from achieving top quartile returns. We need to be willing to take positions when we have conviction. We need to take positions that align with our clients' expectations and our regulatory obligations. This doesn't. Derek had glared at me across the conference table. I'm the CIO. Investment decisions are my responsibility, not yours. Investment decisions are your responsibility. Risk assessment is mine. My job is to identify when proposed trades fall outside acceptable parameters. This one does. And my job is to generate returns. I'm overriding your objection. The trade is being executed today. If you execute this trade over my explicit objection, I'm documenting it in writing and escalating to the CEO. Do what you need to do. The trade is happening. I'd written the memo that afternoon. Clear, factual, professional. Outlined the trade, explained my concerns, documented that I'd objected and been overridden, noted that the position violated our stated risk parameters and potentially our fiduciary obligations to clients, sent it to Derek with copies to the CEO and to Monica Barrett in HR. The CEO had scheduled a meeting for the following week. Before that meeting happened, Derek apparently decided the problem wasn't the trade. It was me. Wednesday afternoon, Monica called me into the conference room. Derek was already there, along with Monica and a folder that I recognized immediately as a termination package. "James, we need to discuss a personnel matter," Monica said, using the carefully neutral tone that HR directors develop for delivering bad news. "Derek has raised concerns about your performance and your ability to work collaboratively with the investment team." "What concerns specifically?" Derek leaned forward. "You've repeatedly refused to approve trades that are within my authority to execute. You've escalated disagreements to senior management rather than working constructively to find solutions. You've created a culture of excessive caution that's preventing the firm from achieving its strategic objectives. My job is risk management. Identifying risks that exceed our parameters and raising concerns about them isn't refusing to be collaborative. It's doing exactly what I was hired to do. Your job is to support the investment team's success. Instead, you've been an obstacle. The distressed debt trade is a perfect example. You blocked a profitable opportunity because of theoretical concerns that weren't supported by proper analysis. My analysis was thorough and documented. The trade violated multiple risk parameters, in your opinion, which isn't the final word on investment decisions. Monica intervened. "James, the situation has become untenable. Derek has lost confidence in your ability to perform the risk management function in a way that supports the firm's goals. We're terminating your employment effective today." I felt something cold settle in my chest. After 3 years of building the risk management function, of establishing protocols that had kept Meridian out of trouble during volatile markets, of doing exactly what I'd been hired to do, I was being fired for doing my job too well. On what grounds? Insubordination, Derek said. Failure to follow direct management instructions, creating a hostile work environment through your refusal to support team decisions. I never refused to follow instructions. I provided risk assessments as required by my role. If you disagree with those assessments, that's a professional disagreement, not insubordination. You were instructed to approve the trade. You refused. That's insubordination. You were advised that the trade violated risk parameters. You overrode my assessment, which is your right as CIO, but that doesn't make my assessment insubordinate. It makes it an accurate technical analysis that you chose to ignore. Monica pulled out paperwork from the folder. We've prepared a termination agreement. Given the circumstances, we're offering 2 weeks severance and continuation of benefits for 30 days. You'll need to return company property today and sign this separation agreement, confirming that you won't pursue legal claims against the firm. 2 weeks, after 3 years of service, after building a risk management function from nothing, after doing exactly what my role required, they were offering 2 weeks severance and expecting me to sign away my rights. "I'd like to review my employment contract before signing anything," I said. "The standard contract doesn't require anything beyond what we're offering," Monica said. 2 weeks is generous, given that this is a termination for cause. "I don't have the standard contract. I negotiated specific terms when I joined. I'd like to review them before responding to this offer." Monica and Derek exchanged glances. "What specific terms?" "Severance provisions, among other things. I'll need to pull the contract and review it with legal counsel before I can respond to your offer." "James, this is a straightforward termination. Signing the separation agreement today allows us to handle this professionally and avoid unnecessary complications." "I'm sure that's what you'd prefer, but I'm not signing anything until I've reviewed my contractual rights. I'll take the termination letter and respond within the timeline required by law." I left that conference room with the termination letter, my personal effects hastily packed into a box, and the sinking feeling that comes from being fired for doing your job correctly. But I also left with something they didn't realize I had, an employment contract that protected me from exactly this scenario. I'd negotiated that contract 3 years earlier, when Meridian had been recruiting me from a competitor. The risk management role was being created. I would be the first director-level hire in that function, and I'd wanted protection against exactly what had just happened. Protection against being fired for doing risk management correctly, for saying no to trades that should be declined, for standing up to investment professionals who didn't like being constrained. The negotiation had been surprisingly straightforward. Meridian's CEO at the time, Gerald Preston, had understood why I wanted special terms. "You're going to tell investment people that they can't do things they want to do," he'd said during the offer discussion. "That's inherently going to create conflict. You want protection against being fired when you do that job correctly." "Exactly. Standard employment contracts define cause too broadly. Someone could argue that disagreeing with the CIO's investment decisions is insubordination, or that preventing profitable trades is poor performance. I need cause defined narrowly enough that doing risk management correctly can't be reframed as a terminable offense." "What specific language do you want?" My lawyer at the time had drafted specific provisions. Standard employment contracts define termination for cause broadly: misconduct, poor performance, violations of company policy. My contract defined it narrowly: fraud, embezzlement, conviction of a felony, material breach of fiduciary duty, or gross negligence in the performance of assigned duties that results in material financial loss to the firm or its clients. The key phrase was gross negligence rather than just negligence, and results in material financial loss rather than just poor judgment. Those qualifiers meant that reasonable professional disagreements about risk, even if I turned out to be wrong, couldn't be reframed as cause for termination. Insubordination wasn't on the list. Failure to follow management instructions wasn't on the list. Creating a hostile work environment through professional disagreement wasn't on the list. And the severance clause was very specific: termination without cause or termination for reasons not explicitly defined in the cause provisions entitled me to 12 months of base salary, 12 months of health insurance continuation, immediate vesting of all equity compensation, and a prorated annual bonus based on target performance levels. 12 months, not 2 weeks. Gerald had approved the terms without much negotiation. This seems fair. You're taking a role that's going to be inherently confrontational at times. You should be protected when you're doing the job we're hiring you to do, even when that job involves saying things investment people don't want to hear. Monica Barrett had countersigned the contract as HR director, though apparently without reading the details carefully. HR had standard templates for employment agreements, and my contract looked superficially similar. Same formatting, same structure, same general sections. But buried in Section 7C, under the termination provisions, were the specific cause definitions and enhanced severance terms that Gerald had approved. I pulled the contract that evening, read it carefully for the first time in 3 years, and felt a grim satisfaction. They'd fired me for cause to avoid paying severance, but the cause they'd alleged wasn't actually cause under my contract, which meant the termination was either without cause, triggering the full severance package, or wrongful, opening them up to additional claims beyond just contract breach. The mathematics were straightforward. My base salary was $185,000. 12 months meant $185,000 in salary payments. Health insurance for 12 months was probably another $24,000 in value. The equity vesting was stock options with approximately 2 years left to vest, worth about $40,000 at current share prices. The prorated bonus at target performance for 10 months of work was around $60,000. Total value, approximately $310,000, versus the 2 weeks they'd offered, which was about $7,000. The difference was significant enough that litigation would be worthwhile if they refused to pay. But litigation was expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Better to give them a chance to fix their mistake before escalating. I called my lawyer Thursday morning. "They fired you for insubordination?" Sarah Chen asked after I'd explained the situation. "That's not in your cause definition." "I know, and I have documentation showing that my risk assessment was technically sound, that I followed proper protocols in escalating my concerns, and that Derek overrode my objection and executed the trade anyway. There's no way to argue I was grossly negligent when I literally warned him in writing about the exact risks that made me object to the trade. What are my options? First, don't sign anything. The separation agreement they offered is designed to waive your contractual rights in exchange for minimal severance. Second, I send them a letter pointing out the contract discrepancy and demanding the full severance package. Third, we see whether they prefer to pay you what they owe or litigate over the meaning of cause. Will they fight it? Maybe. But fighting would require them to argue that failing to approve a trade constitutes gross negligence that resulted in material financial loss. That's a tough argument when you have documentation showing your risk assessment was thorough and technically sound, and when they overrode your professional judgment and executed the trade anyway. How can your objection to a trade have caused financial loss when they did the trade despite your objection? What if they argue my objection prevented other profitable trades from happening? Then they'd need to prove those trades would have been profitable, and that your objections were grossly negligent rather than reasonable professional judgments. That's a nearly impossible burden, especially when your objections were documented and based on legitimate technical concerns. What if they don't settle? Then we sue for breach of contract and wrongful termination. And we probably win because your contract is unambiguous and their termination letter explicitly states grounds that aren't covered by your cause definition. But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Better to resolve it through negotiation if possible. Sarah sent the demand letter Friday afternoon. It was beautifully written, not aggressive, just factual. Quoted the employment contract's cause definition, noted that insubordination didn't appear in that definition, explained that the termination was therefore without cause under the contract terms, and demanded payment of the full severance package within 14 days. Monday morning, Monica Barrett called. "We received your lawyer's letter. I think there's been a misunderstanding about your employment terms." "No misunderstanding. The contract is clear. We weren't aware you had negotiated different severance terms. The standard Meridian contract isn't what I signed. I negotiated specific provisions when I joined, and HR approved them. Those provisions are controlling. Can you send us a copy of the contract? My lawyer will provide it. But, Monica, you should already have it in my employment file. You countersigned it when I started." There was a pause. I could hear papers shuffling, could picture Monica frantically searching for a contract she'd signed 3 years ago without reading the details. "I'm going to need to review this with our legal team," she said finally. "Can you give us a few days?" "Of course. My lawyer set a 14-day deadline in the letter. That gives you time to review and respond appropriately." 3 days later, Sarah received a call from Meridian's general counsel. The conversation was short. They had reviewed the contract, confirmed that my severance provisions were different from standard terms, and acknowledged that insubordination wasn't defined as cause under those provisions. They want to negotiate a settlement, Sarah told me afterward. They'll pay the full severance package you're entitled to, 12 months salary, benefits, equity vesting, prorated bonus. In exchange, they want a mutual separation agreement with standard non-disparagement and confidentiality clauses. What about the characterization of the termination? They'll agree that the termination was without cause, not for cause, which matters for your professional reputation and for any future background checks. Employers who do reference checks specifically ask whether someone was terminated for cause. This ensures the answer is no. And the distressed debt trade? What about it? I want confirmation that my risk assessment was correct, that I was fired for doing my job properly, not for failing at it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's not usually something you can negotiate in a settlement. They're not going to admit wrongdoing or that Derek's decision to override you was a mistake. I'm not asking for admission of wrongdoing. I'm asking for acknowledgement that my risk assessment was within the professional standards expected of someone in my role, and that my objection to the trade was based on legitimate technical concerns rather than incompetence or malice. Why does that matter? You're getting paid. You're getting confirmation the termination wasn't for cause. Why push for more? Because my career is risk management. If word gets out that I was fired for cause for poor risk assessment, that damages my ability to get hired elsewhere in this industry. People talk. Recruiters ask questions. I need the record to be clear that I was fired for political reasons, for saying no when someone with power didn't want to hear no, not because I was bad at my job. That's fair. Let me see what I can negotiate. Sarah negotiated for another week. The back and forth revealed interesting dynamics. Meridian's lawyers wanted a clean separation, pay the contract severance, get mutual releases, move on. But they were resistant to any language that could be interpreted as admitting Derek had been wrong to override my assessment, or that the termination had been inappropriate. They're worried about precedent, Sarah explained during one of our calls. If they acknowledge that your risk assessment was professionally appropriate, it undermines their ability to argue that Derek had authority to override you, which could create problems if other employees challenge management decisions. But Derek did have authority to override me. I never disputed that. I just said my assessment was technically sound and that overriding it carried risks that I'd documented. He had the right to take those risks. I had the right and the obligation to identify them. That's a more nuanced position than most companies want to take. They prefer clear hierarchies where management decisions are final and employee objections are either right or wrong, not a mix of both. Then they need to learn to accept nuance, or they need to pay me to keep quiet about how unnuanced their approach actually is. The final settlement included everything I'd been entitled to under my contract, 12 months salary paid out in bi-weekly installments as if I remained employed, 12 months of health insurance continuation at company expense, immediate vesting of all unvested stock options with a 90-day window to exercise them, and a prorated annual bonus calculated at 100% of target performance levels, plus a carefully worded provision that acknowledged my risk management decisions were within the professional discretion reasonably exercised by qualified risk management professionals in similar circumstances, and that my termination did not reflect any determination of technical incompetence, gross negligence, or failure to meet professional standards expected of a director-level risk management role. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission that Derek had been wrong to override my objection, or that firing me had been a mistake, but it was acknowledgement that I'd been fired for doing my job correctly, just in ways that inconvenienced someone with more organizational power than I had. The settlement also included standard provisions about non-disparagement. I wouldn't say anything publicly that damaged Meridian's reputation. They wouldn't say anything that damaged mine, and confidentiality about the settlement terms. I could tell future employers I'd been terminated without cause and that we'd reached a mutual separation agreement, but I couldn't disclose the specific severance amounts or the language about professional standards. The severance check arrived in November, the first of 26 bi-weekly payments, 12 months of salary paid out over the contractually required period with taxes withheld, as if I remained employed, plus the equity vesting, stock options that would have taken 2 more years to fully vest, now immediately exercisable with 90 days to decide whether to exercise them, plus the bonus, prorated for the 10 months I'd worked that year, calculated at target performance levels regardless of how the firm actually performed. The total was substantial, not life-changing wealth. I wasn't suddenly financially independent, but enough to take time finding the right next opportunity. enough to be selective about where I went next, enough to demonstrate that standing up for professional principles had costs, but those costs were survivable. More importantly, it was enough to send a message to other risk professionals who might find themselves in similar situations. Negotiate your contract carefully when you have leverage. Document your work thoroughly, and don't back down. When doing your job correctly creates political problems. I spent December interviewing risk management positions at firms that appreciated what the role actually required, that understood the difference between obstacle and protection, that wanted someone who would say no when no was the right answer. The interviews were revealing. Every firm asked why I'd left Meridian. I had two answers prepared: the corporate-approved version for reference checks and the honest version for conversations where I was evaluating whether the firm's culture would support me doing the job correctly. The corporate version: the firm made some organizational changes, and we mutually agreed that it made sense for me to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The separation was without cause and amicable. The honest version: the CIO wanted to execute trades that fell outside our risk parameters. I objected based on technical analysis, he overrode my objection, and we had fundamental disagreements about what risk management should look like in that organization. Eventually, those disagreements became untenable, and we agreed it made sense for me to find a better cultural fit. Good firms wanted the honest version. They asked follow-up questions about the specific trade, about how I'd communicated my concerns, about whether I'd documented my objections. They understood that risk management required the ability to say no, and they wanted to know I'd actually done it when circumstances required. Bad firms were satisfied with the corporate version. They didn't dig deeper, didn't want to know about conflicts, preferred the sanitized narrative where departures were always mutual and amicable, and nobody ever disagreed about anything important. I ended up at Sterling Asset Management, a larger firm with a more mature risk culture. The hiring manager was a former risk professional herself, someone who'd navigated similar conflicts and understood what I'd been through. I heard about the Meridian situation, she said during my final interview. Derek Hamilton has a reputation in the industry for running over risk managers. The fact that you stood your ground and won the severance dispute tells me you're exactly the kind of professional we need here. I didn't win. I just had a contract that protected me from being fired unfairly without compensation. You won because you were smart enough to negotiate that contract in the first place. Most people don't think about protecting themselves when they're being recruited. They're excited about the opportunity. They trust that the relationship will work out. They don't imagine they'll ever need contractual protection against being fired for doing their job correctly. You did. That's the kind of forward-thinking risk assessment we value. What happens here when risk management disagrees with investment decisions? We talk about it. Sometimes risk approves the trade with modifications, smaller position size, different entry price, additional hedging. Sometimes investment modifies the trade based on risk feedback. Sometimes we agree to disagree and escalate to the CIO or CEO for a final decision. But disagreement isn't treated as insubordination. It's treated as a valuable input into the decision-making process. And if I say no to something the CIO really wants to do, then we have a serious conversation about why you're saying no, whether your concerns are valid, and whether there's a way to structure the trade that addresses those concerns. But at the end of that conversation, risk management has veto authority over trades that violate our stated parameters. That's policy, not just practice. The CIO can't override you without board approval. That was the difference. At Meridian, Derek had treated risk management as advisory, useful input that he could accept or reject based on his judgment. At Sterling, risk management had actual authority, not unlimited authority, not the ability to stop everything, but genuine veto power over trades that fell outside approved parameters. I started at Sterling in February, 4 months after being fired from Meridian. The distressed debt trade that Derek had executed over my objection had indeed lost money, not catastrophically, but enough to validate my concerns about recovery assumptions and liquidity risk. The bonds had traded down after Meridian's purchase. The bankruptcy proceedings had taken longer than expected, and the recovery value had come in below Derek's projections. I heard through the industry network that Derek had made several other aggressive trades in the interim, chasing returns without appropriate risk management oversight. Meridian had hired a new risk manager in January, someone with less experience who was unlikely to push back as forcefully as I had. I hoped for their client's sake that either the new risk manager found ways to constrain Derek, or Derek learned something from his failures. I doubted either would happen. The lesson wasn't really about Derek, though, or even about Meridian specifically. It was about the value of negotiating employment terms that protected you from predictable problems. About understanding that corporate power dynamics could make doing your job correctly into a firing offense, and that the only defense was contractual protection negotiated before the conflict arose, when you had leverage and they wanted something from you. About documentation, not just the employment contract that specified what cause actually meant, but also the detailed risk assessments, the email trails, the meeting minutes that demonstrated you'd done your job professionally, even when someone with authority didn't like the results. About knowing your rights and being willing to enforce them, even when enforcement meant confrontation with former employers who preferred you, just accept their interpretation of events and move on quietly. Some managers will fire you for doing your job if your job involves telling them things they don't want to hear. The only defense is contractual protection negotiated before the conflict arises, plus documentation that proves you did your job correctly, plus willingness to fight when they try to reframe doing your job correctly as cause for termination. I think about that Wednesday afternoon sometimes, about sitting in the conference room, listening to Derek explain why my professional judgment constituted insubordination, about Monica offering 2 weeks severance for 3 years of work, about the satisfaction of pulling out the employment contract and watching their expressions change when they realized they'd made an expensive mistake. They terminated me for insubordination. The severance clause said otherwise. And the difference between those two interpretations was worth approximately $200,000 and the preservation of my professional reputation. The city looks different now from my Sterling office. Similar view, different company, better risk culture. I'm doing the same work I did at Meridian, but with leadership that understands what risk management requires. When I say no to a trade, we have conversations about why rather than accusations of insubordination. When I identify concerns, they're treated as valuable input rather than obstacles. Not every firm is like Meridian, not every CIO is like Derek, but enough of them are that protecting yourself contractually isn't paranoia. It's prudent risk management applied to your own career. Some mornings I think about sending Derek a note. Not vindictive, just informational. Letting him know that the trade he executed over my objection lost money, that the severance dispute cost Meridian more than just keeping me would have, that firing your risk manager for doing risk management correctly is expensive in ways that don't always show up in immediate P&L. But I haven't sent it. Some lessons are too expensive for thank you notes. They terminated me for insubordination. The severance clause said otherwise, and reading the fine print made all the difference.